In today's episode of the Universe channel, we'll cover Story of Vietnam Part 1. Let us examine how Vietnam transformed from a war-damaged, low-income country into a major export-driven economy and how this connects to a longer pattern of absorbing external influence without losing civilizational identity. We begin in 1975, at the end of the Vietnam War. The country is unified but materially exhausted. Estimates suggest around 3 million deaths. Large parts of infrastructure, roads, railways, irrigation were damaged. Agricultural land in some areas was degraded due to the bombing and chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange. Industrial capacity was limited, and what existed was regionally fragmented between the former North and South. So the baseline is not just poverty, but total structural disruption. To understand Vietnam's response to it, we need a longer timeline. For roughly 1,000 years, parts of Vietnam were under Chinese imperial rule, particularly during the period known as the Chinese domination of Vietnam. During this time, Vietnam adopted Confucian administrative systems, civil service exams, hierarchical bureaucracy, written scripts based on classical Chinese. But at the same time, local language, village governance, and cultural practices persisted. Even when formal institutions resembled China, social organization at the village level remained distinct. This creates a recurring pattern: institutional borrowing combined with cultural continuity. The pattern continues under French colonial rule in Vietnam. The French reorganized the economy towards export oriented agriculture, rice, rubber, and introduced new infrastructure, railways, ports, administrative centers. Urban space was redesigned. In Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, you see wide boulevards, zoning, and European civic architecture. Examples include the Hanoi Opera House and the Saigon Central Post Office. These were not mere symbolic structures, they represented administrative control, communication networks, and urban order. French influence also entered daily consumption patterns. Bread, coffee, and dairy products became part of an urban life. But these were not replicated exactly. The baguette evolved into banh mi, shorter, lighter crust, filled with local meats, herbs, and pickled vegetables. Coffee shifted towards Robusta beans, strong concentration and slow drip preparation. Condensed milk replaced fresh milk in many cases due to cost and storage constraints. So, again, inputs are external, outputs are localized. Now, move to the US phase of the conflict. From the late 1950s to 1975, Vietnam became a central theater in the Cold War geopolitics involving the United States. The country was divided: North Vietnam under a socialist system, and South Vietnam aligned with the US and its allies. The scale of intervention was significant. At peak, over 500,000 US troops were deployed. There were sustained bombing campaigns, including Operation Rolling Thunder, targeting infrastructure and supply lines. Chemical defoliants like Agent Orange were used to reduce forest cover and disrupt agriculture. From an economic perspective, this had several effects. First, physical capital destruction. Bridges, roads, and farms were repeatedly damaged. Second, labor disruption. Large portions of the population were mobilized or displaced. Third, environmental impact, affecting agricultural productivity in a lot of regions. At the same time, wartime logistics created parallel systems. Supply chains operated through decentralized networks, including routes like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This required coordination at local levels rather than centralized industrial systems. So, even under conflict, adaptation occurred, but in decentralized, resource constrained ways. After 1975, Vietnam attempted to consolidate under a centrally planned economy. The state controlled prices, production quotas, and distribution. Agriculture was collectivized. Private enterprise were restricted. Trade was limited partly due to geopolitical isolation. The intention was coordination and equality, but incentive structures were weak. Farmers had limited motivation to exceed quotas, markets were underdeveloped, resource allocation was inefficient. The outcomes were visible: Food shortages persisted. Inflation rose sharply, exceeding 400% in some years during the 1980s. Informal markets emerged because formal systems could not meet demand. At the household level as well, you see adaptation continued. In some regions, alternative protein sources, including dog meat, were part of consumption patterns. At the same time, small innovations appeared. Egg coffee, combining egg yolk, sugar, and coffee, emerged partly due to milk scarcity. These are micro level adjustments, but they reflect the same underlying behavior, working within constraints. The structural turning point comes in 1986 with Doi Moi. The reforms introduce market mechanisms into a socialist framework. Key elements include decollectivization of architecture, households receive land use rights, price liberalization, allowing market pricing for many goods, legalization of private enterprise in stages, and opening to foreign direct investment. The effect is primarily on incentives. Farmers can now benefit directly from increased output. Small businesses can operate with more autonomy. Foreign firms bring capital, technology, and export connections. Agricultural output rises significantly. Vietnam transitions from food deficit to one of the world's leading rice exporters within a few years. In 1995, Vietnam normalizes relations with the United States. This reduces trade barriers and improves access to global markets. Over time, Vietnam joins international economic institutions and trade agreements. Manufacturing expands, particularly in textiles, electronics, and assembly based industries. The macro outcomes are consistent over time. Poverty declines from around 70% in the 1980s to below 10%. GDP growth averages around 6 to 7% annually over long periods. Exports rise from a low base in the early 1990s to over 300 billion US dollar. Urbanization increases with cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City acting as economic hubs. But at the same time, cultural patterns continue to reflect layered adaptation. Food systems remain efficient and localized. Pho is optimized for quick preparation and balanced nutrition. Banh mi reflects colonial influence but local modification. Coffee culture combines global commodity production with distinct preparation styles. Companies like Trung Nguyen Coffee scale these into modern formats. Now, tourism adds a more visible, outward facing layer to this transformation. Vietnam today attracts millions of international visitors each year. But what is notable is not just the volume of tourism, it is the diversity of experiences built on different historical layers. In places like Ha Long Bay, visitors see natural landscapes, limestone karsts, coastal formations, which are now integrated into a global tourism economy. In cities like Hanoi, tourists walk through the old quarter where narrow streets, local markets, and dense commercial activity reflect pre colonial urban patterns. At the same time, just a few blocks away, French colonial buildings, administrative offices, villas, cafes continue to define the visual identity of the city. In Ho Chi Minh City, glass skyscrapers stand next to colonial era structures and both coexist with street level food culture and informal commerce. This creates a layered experience for visitors, not just a single narrative but multiple time periods visible at once. Tourism infrastructure has adapted accordingly. Budget hostels, mid range hotels, and luxury resorts operate simultaneously. Local street vendors serve alongside global restaurant chains. Guided tours range from historical war sites to food walks to motorbike based city explorations. Even war history itself has become an important part of tourism. Sites connected to the Vietnam War, tunnels, museums, preserved locations are visited not just as historical markers but as economic assets integrated into the present. So, tourism in Vietnam is not just consumption of culture, it is also a system that organizes and presents different layers of its past and present. Urban systems show similar layering. Motorbikes dominate due to cost and flexibility. Digital platforms like Grab integrate with this system rather than replacing it. So mobility evolves but does not reset. The overall pattern can be summarized into two interacting layers. At the macro level, policy reform, incentive alignment, and global integration. At the civilizational level, long term continuity in adapting external systems, Chinese administrative models, French urban and cultural inputs, and American linked global economic integration. Vietnam's transformation is therefore not a single event, it's a continuation of a pattern. External systems enter, sometimes through force, sometimes through trade, sometimes through necessity. Vietnam absorbs them selectively, alters them, and fits them into its own structure. If you look at it this way, the story is not just about recovery after war, it is something about something much more stable. A system that does not collapse under pressure but reorganizes. A system that does not reject external influence but filters it. And an economy that does not grow by abandoning its past but by layering new systems on top of it. So when you walk through Vietnam today, whether it is a street in Hanoi, a cafe serving egg coffee, a colonial building still in use, or a crowded motorbike intersection, you're not just seeing growth, you're seeing continuity under change. And this is what makes this transformation durable. Not just fast, but sustained. And this is why Vietnam's story does not end with recovery. It continues not as a sudden rise, but as a quiet, ongoing emotion. Like a river that has changed its course many times but never stopped flowing. A place where layers of history do not disappear, they settle, overlap, and become part of the present. Where every street carries more than one time period, and every detail, a cup of coffee, a building, a road, holds memory and adaptation together.